accordion scale of buccal. What's the rumpus?
Well, hello, welcome once again. This is Michael Penn. I am your host for What's the Rumpus, our weekly talk show host. At least we try to do it weekly, and we don't always succeed, but this week we did succeed, and we have a nice guest. His name is Mr. Rob Fahey.
Nice to be here.
Rob is going to talk to us about the Japanese opposition parties, and you might hear a little bit of noise circulating around here, and that's because we're filming in the Pink Cow restaurant in Roppongi, so please forgive us a little background noise. Well, Mr. Fahey, first of all, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, and why you're studying Japanese opposition parties and politics?
Well, I'm originally from Ireland, and I lived in the UK working as a journalist for about 10 years. And after that I went back to university, decided that journalism full-time wasn't necessarily for me, and started studying politics. And I ended up at Waseda University here in Tokyo. My actual focus is on political communication and how Japanese parties market, or often fail to market, themselves to the electorate. But obviously at the moment what's very interesting is this attempt by the opposition parties to align themselves ahead of a possible election. And that ties into my field, it ties into this question of political marketing and communication, but also obviously has a very big influence on what's going to happen to the Japanese government and to possible Japanese policy making over the next 5 to 10 years. How those parties manage to stitch themselves together and whether what results is a Frankenstein's monster is a very big issue that I think anyone who's interested in Japanese politics probably has one eye on right at the moment.
Okay, and just to finish up with you yourself, you're heading probably for an academic career now, or eventually back into journalism?
Well, we'll see who'll pay me money, but the academic career is top of the list at the moment.
Yeah, well, journalism doesn't pay money.
Why do you think I'm here?
Keep your children away from journalism.
I agree.
All right. Well, we're talking about opposition realignment. Myself and my company, we were at the recent coming together of the Democratic Party, which of course was a combination of the Democratic Party of Japan and the Japan Innovation Party, which at least the wing that was led by Yorihisa Matsuno. How do you evaluate this aspect of the consolidation? Does it look like it's been done correctly at this stage?
I think the problem with that side of the consolidation is really the question of what is it that these two parties had in common that makes them into a sensible merger candidate?
Well, how about the fact that most of the Japan Innovation Party lawmakers were from the Democratic
Party
of Japan?
Right. You've got 21 lawmakers, 15 of them were originally in the DPJ. And that in itself sort of draws attention to an issue with the DPJ and now with the Democratic Party, which is that it's very hard to say what they stand for. It's extraordinarily difficult to look at that party and figure out what coherently they're offering the electorate, except for the fact that they're not the LDP. And honestly, they might as well put that on their posters right now. Vote for us, we're not the LDP. Which is actually a winning proposition with quite a lot of voters, but not enough to form a government, and certainly really not enough to be a coherent opposition. And I think the issue is that the JIP merger and the creation of this Minshinto has probably brought to the fore in a lot of voters' minds.
We should say to our people who may not be familiar with Japanese language, Minshinto is the Japanese name of the Democratic Party.
It's got one of the kanji from the JIP's name in it, so everybody goes home happy. But one of the problems with the merger and the creation of this new entity is that when I speak to people who are Japanese people who have a vote, unlike us, they often say, well, wasn't the JIP a more right-wing kind of a party? And the DPJ was supposedly a bit like UK's New Labour or something like that. What do they have in common? And the answer is, well, they're not the LDP. So this is a problem.
My view of the Japan Innovation Party, the JIP, was, at least the Matsuno wing of it, was that their main point was sort of deregulation and economic liberalism.
This is because a lot of those people actually didn't come originally from the Osaka Japan or Restoration Party, which this is part of the problem when you start talking about Japanese political opposition parties. There's such a complicated genealogy that it's like Game of Thrones, right? Do I remember that guy? Was he in season 1? Who is he? So obviously you have the JIP. They were originally the Restoration Party, which started out in Osaka. Then they merged with the Unity Party, which had originally been your party, and they were a kind of a neoliberal, not particularly right-wing, but neoliberal economically group. And then it all fell apart again, and the JIP was the rump. And so yes, a lot of those people came from a neoliberal background, rather than necessarily a right-wing political background. The problem, I think, is a lot of voters don't recognize that. They think of the JIP and they think of Hashimoto from Osaka, who's quite a right-wing character. They think of Ishihara from Tokyo, who is a very right-wing character.
Not exactly an economic liberal.
No, not exactly an economic liberal, or indeed a liberal in any sense. And so I think voters are probably, I mean, they think of Kenji Eda, who is the leader of the Unity Party, and he's the only JIP person to have been given a position in the senior governing body of the new Democratic Party. But they think of him and they think of an economic liberal. But in general, the JIP's name is not necessarily connected with economic liberalism.
Yeah,
it was
actually,
connected with...
I think when they split with Hashimoto, their problem was they had no identity.
Exactly.
It was sort of like, well, this is the Hashimoto party that is not Hashimoto anymore, so who are they? They're nobody.
It was a birthday party where the birthday boy had decided to go home.
Yeah, right.
There was no purpose to it anymore. And so that's why they merged. Now, having said all of that, I do think that there is an identity crisis as a result of this merger. I do also think that it might have resolved some problems internally for the Democratic Party, because the DPJ also had an identity problem. The DPJ didn't know who they wanted to be either. And realistically, we just said that a lot of the people from the JIP used to be in the DPJ, so they're just coming home. A lot of the people in the DPJ used to be in the LDP. So, you know, there's a lot of musical chairs that goes on in Japanese politics. The DPJ is largely simply, or was largely simply identified by not being the LDP. And there were people within the DPJ who would see themselves as being very left-wing, who used to be in the old Socialist Party. There are people within the DPJ who would see themselves as economic liberals. And they don't necessarily get along very well together. There was talk up until quite recently that the economic liberal faction might split. And so rather than an opposition alignment, you were going to see opposition fragmentation ahead of this year's elections. What this JIP merger has probably done is cemented the cracks. It's brought some more neoliberal, kind of economically liberal people into the party that those existing economically liberal people can feel comfortable alongside. And it's given a kind of a sense of unity to the party, at least on a sort of social level, if not on a policy level.
Okay, so just before we leave this point, so you believe that this merger will solidify the new Democratic Party as a party that's basically in favor of economic neoliberalism?
Not necessarily. I think this is the problem. It's not really about ideology. It's about whether these people feel comfortable working with one another. And that's a constant, ongoing factor within Japanese politics. Everyone's ideology seems to be quite malleable. It's a question of who they can work with, who they're willing to share a party with, who they're willing to share a platform with. I think that the introduction of the JIP into the DPJ and the creation of this new party has probably ended talk of a split. But I don't necessarily think it's fixed the question of what their ideology is, or what they believe in, or what policies they want to implement. And you can see that from the fact that the next thing they've moved on to do is talk about aligning themselves with the communists in the next election.
Yes, you mentioned the Japan Communist Party. Well, there's been some really remarkable developments in that sphere. The Japan Communist Party since last year seems to be making a concerted effort to move to the political center. And they've even proposed to the other opposition parties to possibly create a coalition government that they'd participate in. How do you evaluate this?
Well, it is a very big change for them because they've been political outsiders for a long time. But the changes that they're making in terms of what they're offering in terms of changing their policy platforms are not all that different. It's not actually that much of a big sacrifice for the JCP, because since the 1950s they've been more of a democratic socialist party than a communist party. And I think all of us hear the word communist and have a very clear idea of what that means. The JCP haven't really stood for that since the 50s, which is why they were permitted to continue being active here, even under the Allied occupation. The Supreme Command of Allied Powers in Japan had no problem with the JCP. They actually saw them as very cooperative and pro-constitution. And that's kind of continued until now. They are a party of protest. They are a democratic socialist party, but they're not really communist in the sort of Soviet or Chinese sense of the word communist. And as a result, what they're
Democratic
offering...
socialism is what Bernie Sanders is calling himself.
It's what Bernie Sanders would call himself.
So are you saying that the Japan Communist Party is what we should see as the Bernie Sanders of Japan?
Yes, in very much the same way that Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom is on a very similar platform. And one of the reasons that the JCP is so keen to appeal a little bit more broadly at the moment is because they're one of the only parties picking up new votes. Particularly, if young people go out to vote, they primarily vote for the JCP. And that also has parallels with the Sanders movement in the United States. He wins a very large majority of youth votes. When the JCP manages to motivate people under 35, under 40 to go out and vote, they vote for the JCP. The other parties have very little appeal among younger voters. There's a lot of reasons perhaps around that. I think a big part of it is that if you were born since the early 1980s, the word communism or the word socialist doesn't have the same connotations for you. There's a whole generation who, growing up in Japan, in Britain, in America, who simply don't see communism or socialism as necessarily being an evil, but just an alternative. Of course, that means that it's very difficult for the JCP to pick up voters at the higher end of the age spectrum, and that's why they need an alignment with other parties. But they are in an interesting position. You know, they've won electoral victories in the last 3 or 4 years that no one would have believed possible 10 years ago. Nobody's thinking that they're about to have a breakthrough and become a main party of opposition, but realistically they could be a very powerful party of a coalition government.
No, you say that, but they're almost certainly going to nail down the number 2 opposition party position, except maybe Osaka Ishin would be a possible rival for that.
Well, they'll probably be number 2 or 3, but it's a very distant second or third. Their problem is that their vote at the moment, it can surge when young people turn out to vote. That's what happened in Okinawa, where they had won a very major electoral victory last year. But in general, it's stuck somewhere around 10 to 15% of the vote, not dissimilar to the LDP's coalition partner Komeito, who also have a very set percentage of the vote that they pretty much always win. What makes the JCP really interesting from an electoral perspective, thinking about electoral cooperation, is that if they have this loyal vote almost everywhere in the country, and there are some places they're a little stronger, they're much stronger here in Tokyo, for example, but if they have that loyal vote and they can pass that on to a coalition partner in an election, they could swing quite a large number of seats towards their partner. That is a completely untested theory. It's what's going on in the heads of the Democratic Party, of the JCP, of all of the other opposition parties at the moment. It's also going through the heads of the LDP, who have really, really stepped up the heat on the JCP in the last couple of months. There have been some quite wild accusations about the JCP being a kind of a dodgy criminal organization coming out of the LDP, which, if anything, has probably just increased their cachet with younger voters. But ultimately, everybody's looking at this, everybody's realizing these guys could swing a bunch of elections that are relatively close. But it is completely untested because nobody knows what a JCP voter does when their party tells them to vote for someone else.
Well, you mentioned that the JCP could possibly swing some elections, but if you listen to the conservatives inside the Democratic Party, people like Goshi Hosono or Seiji Maehara, they're ferociously against that idea. They say, no, it won't, because if the Democratic Party gets tied up with these guys, we're going to lose as many people from the center as we're going to gain from the left.
Yep.
And you say it's untested, but how do you evaluate that? Do you think that these guys are onto something, or are they just stuck in ideology land?
I think the question is how ideological Japanese voters really are. Your average JCP voter must be quite ideological, or else they wouldn't be voting for the JCP. The average DPJ voter, I'm not entirely convinced. And the one thing that is tested is the counterflow, the possibility of votes from the DPJ flowing to the JCP. And that's actually very powerful. We can see that in the last House of Representatives election in 2014. There were a number of constituencies where the DPJ couldn't stand a candidate. After they were routed in 2012, they just didn't have enough candidates to put up in all of the constituencies. And so there were quite a few places where the DPJ didn't have a candidate in play, and the JCP was the only opposition to the LDP in that constituency. And in those constituencies, the JCP picked up tens of thousands of votes. So there are obviously a lot of DPJ voters who are perfectly happy to vote for someone from the JCP if it stands the slightest chance of keeping the LDP out of power. Whether that flows the other way, I don't know.
All right, but it sounds to me like your inclination is to say that the Democratic Party would be well advised to link arms with the JCP in order to defeat the LDP. You think that that's a more viable approach than to keep them at arm's length?
I think they need to figure out what the potential utility and the potential risk to themselves is. Because, for one thing, linking arms with the JCP won't defeat the LDP. I've run a bunch of numbers and simulations across the figures from the last couple of election cycles. And assuming that we have a double election this year, which seems to be the consensus of most political analysts, if every single vote the JCP got in 2014 were to be transferred to the Democratic Party, and I'm also making the assumption that every vote that the JIP got transfers nice and neatly over to the new combined party, which might not necessarily be true. If all of them transferred across, they would win 70 seats. 3 seats for the JCP, 67 seats for the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. That still doesn't give them a majority.
No, far from it.
The LDP would still be in majority. They would also be unable to get a twisted diet in the House of Councillors.
Yeah.
The very, very best case scenario, allowing for a whole load of fantastic things to happen for them on election day, is that the JCP and the Democratic Party working together, sharing votes in the most intelligent of way to support candidates wherever they're needed. The best scenario that I can come out with from any model is that they split the House of Councillors evenly, 121 to 121. And a bunch of independents would probably support the government. So they wouldn't even be able to get the 2010 result that the LDP had, where you had a twisted diet that really crippled that government.
But the sum is really greater than the parts, isn't it? Because, for example, if you looked at the polling ahead of the merger of the Democratic Party, the DPJ was polling about 7 or 8%, and the Japan Innovation Party was polling 1% or under. So you add that together, that should be 8 or 9%. But as soon as they merged, they were getting 13% support in some polls.
Yeah, it kind of depends on which polls you look at, though, because there were others. I think it was the Yomiuri Shimbun, which admittedly is a very LDP-friendly paper. But the Yomiuri Shimbun had them polling at about 7% and 3%, so they should have got 10. And then when the first poll after the merger came out, they got 6%.
I find that to be a little...
I also find that to be a little unusual. It might just be a lack of name recognition for the new name, but I think there is a question mark over how well the two parties perform together. One big concern I have is that almost all of the JIP's MPs are proportionally elected. So they only bring 4 single-seat constituencies with them, and they'll win those 4 single-seat constituencies. Everywhere else, they're genuinely relying on voters in the proportional ballot being able to weigh in behind this party. So there's a possibility of a lot of those JIP seats disappearing at the next House of Representatives election.
Well, as we swing into the final section here, I want to step back a little bit from, and to sort of, it seems to me from my sense of speaking to Japanese people about the opposition parties and what they feel, is there's just a lack of trust there. They don't feel that they have the capability to govern. They don't feel that the LDP, they say we hate them, but at least they put together a reasonably competent government, which the DPJ during its 3 years did not give the impression of having done. It's if the Japanese people get the sense that the opposition is actually a viable governing alternative to the LDP, I think that they could win quite easily.
The difference between the LDP being in government and the opposition being able to form a government is turnout. The LDP has won all of its elections since the DPJ went out of power. All of Abe's elections have been won on a very, very low turnout. with a smaller actual number of votes for the LDP than Taro Aso got when he lost to the DPJ in 2009. Shinzo Abe has never won as many votes as Taro Aso won. That's embarrassing.
That's interesting.
But it's because Turnout collapsed after the collapse of the DPJ. Because an awful lot of Japanese people, feeling exactly what you've just said, that the opposition was not offering a realistic alternative, rather than say, oh well, I best go out and vote for the LDP then, they just stayed home. When those voters see that there is something out there that is a genuine alternative, that gets them off their backsides to go to a polling station on polling day, the LDP will be out of power again. But at the moment, there's really very little sign of them offering that. The opposition at the moment offers nothing but opposition, which sounds like a silly thing to say, but all they do is criticize the government. They never seem to have an alternative to offer. At the start of this segment, we talked about the fact that it's very hard to pin down what it is that the Democratic Party actually stands for. Nobody really knows what the Democratic Party would do if they were in government. We know that they wouldn't do Abenomics because they don't like Abenomics. We know that they wouldn't do nuclear the same way because they've sort of weighed in behind a whole bunch of public protest issues. Abenomics, nuclear power, the security bills, whatever is in the news right now. And they've said, yes, this is terrible, without ever saying, and here's what we would do differently.
Well, it's actually worse than that. I recently interviewed a Democratic Party lawmaker, and his opinion was it's completely hopeless for us to try to sort out policy within our party right now. First we have to win power, then we'll figure out the policies.
And that's not how it works, because the fundamental thing of a democratic system is that you can't vote against a party, right? You cannot go to the polls and vote against the LDP. Now some people will. Some people will just go and vote for anyone who isn't the LDP. But fundamentally, the vast majority of voters will go out and vote for something they want in power, or they'll stay at home. And that's what we've seen since 2012, is that voters who don't see anything that they like on the opposition benches stay at home. The DPJ, or the DP as it is now, is never going to be in power until it sorts out a policy platform and until it shows the Japanese people, here is our alternative. You can't win power and then figure out what you want to do with it, unless you're a medieval king, which they're not, I think.
All right, well, that's I think that's an interesting point to end on. We're not medieval kings ourselves.
Sadly not, no.
But we can right now have a feast as if we are medieval kings. So the Pink Cow restaurant here is a Cal-Mex restaurant which serves burritos and other delicious things.
Those were very popular with medieval kings, I
That's
heard,
right,
actually,
I know. Yes.
Yeah.
Many kings of England were
Yes,
burrito fans.
big
I
into
heard, yeah.
burritos.
But would you be willing to stick around a little longer to have dinner with us before you take off?
I've been offered a feast, how could I refuse?
All right, well, there we go. He's been offered a feast, and you have also been offered a feast of this latest episode of What's the Rumpus? A feast of the mind, of course. We hope.
Is that as good as burritos? I'm not.
Well, it's not as good as burritos, but it's as good as they're going to get. All right, so thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Yes, we do have a guest next week. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
What more can